Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
There is so much talk at the moment around sustainability, lowering of carbon, and I wanted to explore how technology can help farmers be part of the solution to the climate crisis that we're hearing more and more about every day. And as a result, Agritech, or agriculture tech, is a hot sector right now. So I wanted to learn more about regenerative agriculture practices, the role that technology can play in bringing them all together, and the many different players that are working in this area at the moment. And I found the perfect guest. His name is Simon Haldrup. He's waiting for us in Denmark right now. He's an incredibly cool guy. He's going to be talking about Agreena, which is an agtech company working with farmers across the pan-European ecosystem in their transition to regenerative agriculture practice. And it was actually founded within the industry by visionary farmers and fintech-savvies. And what I found really interesting about this story is what it originated as an online commodity trading marketplace went on to become one of the first carbon farming platforms in the pan-European landscape. And they're using a set of core principles to regenerate soil, the company's unique vertically integrated solution, which suggests putting the farmers first, backing with the knowledge, support and incentives to implement sustainable agricultural practices, but at scale. But how do they do that? What is the technology? How is technology transforming the world of farming? We're going to talk about all that and much more. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Denmark, where Simon Haldrup is waiting to speak with us. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me. My name is Simon Haldrup. I'm currently the CEO for a company called Agreena, located in Denmark. And it's an agtech, climate tech startup.
Well, before we learn a little bit more about that, I always like to take my guests back in time. So I've got to ask you, where did your passion for tech and agriculture come from? How did those worlds collide? What lit the spark and put you on this path you're on right now?
Oh yeah, it's a complicated journey. Well, the spark started back when I was 10. I think I got my first Commodore 64 and started playing around with it. And I think there are phases in life, right? First, being very fascinated with technology itself. As a background later on in robotics engineering, I was fascinated on how we could create autonomous robots that could do and think on their own. But afterwards, spending 14 years in banking and financial services really taught me how we can take technology and actually use it as an enabler to build new ventures, new services, new offerings to customers that they can use fundamental products in a different way. So really seeing technology as an enabler. My background in agriculture is rather limited. So after my journey ended in banking, I was really looking to funnel that experience from technology and financial engineering to a truly meaningful purpose. And I was so lucky to meet my two co-founders, Ida and Julie. And we really came together around that mission to create a scalable transformation of the food and agriculture ecosystem.
Love that. And what a great story. And after interviewing nearly 2,000 people on here, the amount of people that have come on here and said that the Commodore 64 played a pivotal role in where they got to. And our parents at the time thought we were just sat in there playing games and not copying code out of magazines and books and things. But I mean, today kids are often ostracized for, they're just playing games and they should be doing something more productive. But that Commodore 64 is proof of what it can lead to, right?
Oh yeah, it is really, being a Dane, there's that Søren Kierkegaard quote that the life is lived forward but experienced backwards, right? And I think this is a good example of it.
It really is. And of course, it was that path that led you to AgreenaCarbon. But can you tell the listeners a little bit more about what this tech platform is and the kind of problems that you set out to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a complex one, to be honest with you. Sometimes I wish we just did and audit our accounting system. But we are really trying to solve a big problem. So let's start with the problem, because if we look at, most people thinking about agriculture today see a problem in itself. And what we're really trying to address is that farmland today accounts for approximately a third of total GHG emissions. And therefore, everyone knows that farming has to change. The big problem is that we also have a growing population. And therefore, that farming and ag is really driving that two-edged sword of polluting, but also feeding the world. And what really occurred to us is that we can fundamentally change that narrative if we can make farming at scale change to regenerative practices. And it's such an interesting solution, because it actually solves a multifaceted problem at the same time. Because we see in some areas of Europe, we see huge challenges of soil health and soil degradation. We see challenges, obviously, with GHG emissions from arable farming production. We see water quality problems, but we also see actually an opportunity to turn that completely around and actually enable soils, normal agricultural soils, to be carbon sinks, to use them as a flat battery that we recharge with carbon from the atmosphere to capture and store in our agricultural soils. And it's as simple as that. If we could make that happen, we would have probably the most scalable solution driver to our climate crisis, because approximately half of the world's land is farmland. So theoretically, if we thought about changing the production process on all that land into regenerative, it would kind of equate planting a forest the size of Australia. And that's the solution we're addressing. The big problem is that it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen because farmers are operating on very thin margins. It takes risks, it takes investments to transition. And if you combine those factors, it doesn't happen on its own.
And that's one of the things that really stood out about you guys when I was doing a bit of research, and also how farmers now get to be part of the solution to the climate crisis. So is that something you can expand on, and how the farmers get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, as simple as it sounds, right? If we could just make farmers change behavior, then we could, and do it at scale, then we would sit with a fantastic solution of better soils, carbon, not only reductions, but even net removals, better biodiversity, better water quality. It sounds like a fantastic solution. And the problem is, as I said, there's no economic incentive. And therefore, what we are fundamentally doing is to connect the farmer and the transition of the farmer generating environmental outcomes to the voluntary carbon market. Because on the other hand, it more or less becomes a ticket to play for corporates these days to become carbon neutral. Their problem is that it takes time to change, to reduce emissions, to adjust their supply chains, and so on and so forth. And therefore, they're buying carbon offsets. And if we can connect those two ends of the value chain, so on the one hand, corporates buying carbon offsets, and on the other hand, farmers needing an economic incentive, then we can actually drive a positive reinforcing loop. And in a nutshell, that's what our technology solution ensures. Because the challenge is that there's a long bridge between those two points, because we need to be able to measure, verify, issue carbon credits, manage permanence and quality, and a range of other factors for this to be meaningful. And that's basically what we do with our carbon farming platform.
And it's such a hot topic right now for good reason. And more businesses are broadcasting their carbon status. I was on a flight to Utah last week, for example, on a Delta flight, and the napkin that was presented to me with my drink said we've been carbon negative since last year or something like that. Yeah. But I'm curious, here in Europe, what are the recent developments in the European carbon market? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, I think, globally, we actually see Europe leading. And there's a very simple metric for that. One is just the price of carbon credits in the voluntary carbon markets, which is significantly higher in Europe than in the US, for example. And secondly, the quality requirements, because to be honest, it's also such a hot topic because there's such a high variance in the voluntary carbon market. So there's very low quality carbon credits and there's very high quality carbon credits. And therefore, it's such an unregulated, almost, the modern West kind of market at this point in time. What really happens in Europe, and especially in this category, because we're moving from a market dominated by a supply from forestry, afforestry, reforestation, but also has a roof, a glass ceiling to it, really moving into nature-based solutions such as farmland. What EU is doing, and also other organizations, is to start really applying regulation and standards around this to narrow in the quality variations of these carbon credits so they become high affinity and high quality, and therefore also supporting the integrity of this market, which I think for all relevant players is a very positive thing, but still really allowing the private market to drive this change.
It really does. And I'm curious, how does everything that we're talking about here, such as regenerative agriculture practices and technology, how does all that come together? And do you have maybe a use case that you could share just to bring everything we're talking about alive there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the best possible use case is to see it from the eye height of a farmer. And what we really see is that there's a huge segment of farmers that have understood the opportunity for both economic and environmental benefits of transitioning, but is held back by short-term profit losses. And when they see this opportunity, so basically what they do is, in this case, they log on the Agreena platform, and then they basically put in a lot of data on each of their fields. So they put in data on soil characteristics, historic management practice. Have I been tilling it? What kind of crops have I been growing? What kind of fertilizers have I been using? And so on and so forth, which allows us to establish basically a starting point of their GHG profile in this specific field. And then they start strategizing. They start planning for the next harvest year. Now they'll start using cover crops. They'll reduce their tillage intensity. They'll start using organic amendments or whatever combination, leave residue on the surface of the soil, and so on and so forth. It's basically a toolbox for the farmers to adopt. And each of those drivers gives a different effect, given the local circumstances, climate, soil conditions, and so on. And we all compute that within the platform. So the farmer starts to optimize both on his yield outcome and his carbon outcome. That's why it's called carbon farming. And then the harvest year goes by, and that's the plan. And then the farmer continuously input to the platform what he actually did. And after the harvest, then we apply satellite imagery and in-field inspections to really verify that what the farmer has claimed to have happened has really happened. And there we use a lot of technology, especially satellite imagery and a lot of advanced neural networks, basically, to be able to scale such a verification. And once that's all verified, and secondly, third-party independently verified, then we can issue the carbon certificate. We can sell it in the market, and therefore we give the farmer a new revenue stream.
And of course, anyone that's worked in the tech industry will know all too well what happens if you put garbage in, you get garbage out. So the question I've got to ask is, how do you ensure the quality of those carbon credits and ensure that you measure what matters?
Yeah, and it's basically a combination, and this is fundamentally systems design, right? Because it is on the one hand, it is filtering the input, being sure that there's reason in the inputs that are taken from the farmer, to the extent possible, sourcing inputs from credible sources, and so to minimize error variance in the inputs. But secondly, is of course to get unbiased, observable outcome factors, such as vegetation indexes that we can achieve from satellite imagery. We can see field boundaries, we can see tillage patterns, and so on and so forth. So more and more, we can use the combination of low orbit satellite imagery combined with a lot of learning algorithms to really derive at a very, very high resolution and quality the realities of what has actually happened. And then we, of course, input that in models because the biology in the soil is really, really complex. So fusing the observed behavior combined with biology modeling gives us then the reductions and removals that are taking place.
And as someone that's working right in the heart of all this, what is the state of the market and industry at the moment, and where do you see it all heading?
I think. Well, first of all, I see this as still early phase. But with that, technology growth curve that we all know. And it starts with the farmers. Everything here starts with the farmers. And if we just compare the size of the segment of farmers that were starting to look into this, compared to a year ago, it is amazing. It's absolutely amazing. This transition is happening. We also see the entire industry pressing on for this transition. We see regulators, we see food manufacturers, we see input providers. So the entire ecosystem around the agricultural industry is pushing for this transition. So we see this as early stage, but really, really picking up. And I think most importantly, if you look at it from the other end of the time spectrum, everyone can see if we need to be carbon neutral or net zero by 2050 at the latest, then we need to have solid processes of removing carbon from the atmosphere. We need to be able to create negatives, and we can fundamentally do that in a mechanical way or in a chemical biological way. And this category, if we can manage all the challenges that are also scientifically connected with this category, if we can manage that in a good way, it probably offers the most scalable and the most economic viable approach to creating these removals. And this is why the politicians are extremely occupied with this topic as well.
I know so much on the news at the moment. It is very uncertain times for so many different reasons, and we were talking about that before we started recording today. But what excites you about the future, or even just makes you hopeful about the future, and what are you going to be focusing on?
Yeah, luckily there's a lot that makes me hope positive for the future. I think within this category, I think I go back to the farmers here and say, as being a city boy from Copenhagen, I have to admit my understanding of farmers historically has been limited, and I think I share that characteristics with a lot. But if we look at it, then we have a growing population. We need to be able to feed a growing population on the one hand, and on the other hand, we need to structurally change how agriculture is performed. And I think what I'm really, really hopeful for here is that we have a formula that can kind of optimize within a triangle of food production and then establishing farmers as climate heroes and environmental stewards in this, while as the third corner in that triangle actually bolster their own operation and create an economic viable approach to being a farmer. And if we can make that triangle spin as a flywheel, then I actually think we are solving some of the most fundamental problems in the world today, and that makes me hopeful.
Absolutely. And we did begin the podcast by talking about your origin story, but as we come full circle, I always ask my guests if there was a song, piece of music, movie or book or anything that has inspired and helped them in their career, and ask you to share that story and your choice, and we'll leave the listeners on an inspirational note. Is there anything that you'd leave the listeners with on that?
Yeah, I'm a very diverse on the music side. I like listening to Mozart because I think working in this space is also sometimes it would be great to walk into a glass bubble instead. So a bit of Mozart 37 symphony is a peace of mind. But I think where I really draw my inspiration, and I know it's an old one, it's not very modern, is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah.
Because I think what we have to do around here is also to reimagine fundamental new solutions to existing problems, and actually being able to take that step back and not just using intuition, but actually activate system 2, as it's called in that book, is a fundamental approach I use very much in how we run our operation.
Awesome. Well, I'll add both of those to our wish list and Spotify playlist accordingly. But before I let you go, for anyone listening, just wanting to find out more about Agreena and the work that you're doing and everything we talked about, what's the best starting point?
Yeah, you can absolutely find us at Agreena.com, on LinkedIn, on Facebook. So we are on all social media platforms, and trying to both have a thought leadership in some of these areas, while also ensuring that we put the farmers in the real center of things.
Well, I love what you're doing here at AgreenaCarbon, and how the tech platform, what you're doing, the problems you're solving, and how you're getting the farmers to be part of the solution of climate crisis. But more than anything, I think it's your human story of that city boy in Copenhagen reconnecting with the earth and what's going on around us. I think it's a beautiful story. So thank you for sharing that with us today.
Well, appreciate it. Thanks a lot, Neil.
Wow, what an incredibly cool guy. And I love what they're doing there with Agreena and how they're using technology to solve some of the biggest problems on the planet right now. So for me, learning more about what AgreenaCarbon is, what problems it solves, and how they're helping farmers be part of the solution to the climate crisis, and learning more about regenerative agricultural practices and how tech is bringing all that together, incredibly valuable. And if you're working in this sector, I'd love to bring you into this conversation too. You may have different opinions. You might be working in other ways. I'd love to get your story on here. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Neil C. Hughes, and my website is techblogwriter.co.uk. So I hope you enjoyed our exploration of Agritech today, and I hope you'll join me again tomorrow, where we'll explore a completely different topic of how technology is transforming how lives, work, industry, and even world. But thanks for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.